Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Diane Duffy, and I'll be chairing today's session. We're going to wait for another few seconds while everyone in the waiting room has time to join in, and then we'll get started. So hello, everyone, and on behalf of SSR, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's symposium, the title of which is User Needs for Improved Contraceptive Choice. My name is Diane Duffy. I'm a member of the Contraceptive Symposium Organizing Committee, and I will serve as the chair of today's event. We are very excited to welcome participants from all areas of reproductive biology research and all geographic regions to discuss the challenges and opportunities for new innovations in contraception. Just to cover a few logistics before we begin, all participants will be placed on mute during the session. There will be time for questions after each presentation, and we do look forward to hearing your questions and having our speakers answer them. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature. This is located at the bottom of your screen. Do not use the chat feature, as we will be only monitoring the Q&A feature. At the end of each presentation, I will read questions from the Q&A and the speaker will have a chance to verbally answer them. And finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be made available to all SSR members via the SSR website. So let's go ahead and get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jenny Higgins. Dr. Higgins earned her PhD in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. She had research experience at the CDC and also at the Guttmacher Institute, as well as postdoctoral training at both Princeton and Columbia universities. Dr. Higgins joined the faculty of the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2012, where she is now a professor of gender and women's studies and also obstetrics and gynecology. She's received numerous awards and is very active in professional service, including having served as a board member and the vice chair of the board of directors of the Guttmacher Institute. The titles of her recently funded projects and her numerous publications highlight her research interests, which include such topics as access to contraception among diverse populations, how sexuality influences women's choice of contraceptives, and public awareness of restrictions on access to contraception and abortion care. Dr. Higgins is also an award-winning educator. She offers several courses in her area of expertise, including one wildly popular undergraduate course on women, gender, and health, which enrolls hundreds of students every time it's offered. So we are very fortunate that she agreed to share her work with us today, and the title of her presentation is Sex Matters: Sexual Acceptability's Role in Contraceptive Needs, Choices, and Behaviors. So welcome, Dr. Higgins.
Hi, everybody. Diane, can you hear and see me?
Yes and yes.
Okay,
so please go ahead.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. So my name is Jenny Higgins. I appreciate the introduction and I appreciate the chance to speak with you all today. I think it's wonderful that we're starting this gathering by talking about sex, which is the reason that we're all here, right? So I think as contraceptive researchers, developers, public health providers, healthcare providers, we tend to think more about the devices themselves, right? The mechanism of action, the mode of delivery, whether and how we educate patients about it and get these devices into folks' hands, right? So these are all really important considerations. But in that, we tend to lose sight of the sexual contexts for which contraceptives are used, right? And so there's this real disconnect between how we in the research and development side or the behavioral science side of things, and then the folks who actually use contraceptives in sexual contexts see these things. And I know you all know this, but people don't have sex to use contraception, right? but people do use contraception so they can enjoy pleasurable and satisfying sex free from unwanted pregnancy and STIs, right? There's a wonderful demographer who once said that if an alien came to planet Earth and read demography or clinical journals or public health journals, they would have no idea that sex is something that humans actually enjoy, right? So we really have this sort of scientific disconnect between sex and how we think about contraception and the activities that might lead to unwanted pregnancy. I became interested in this topic as a young person when I was doing counseling in two different abortion clinics. And during those encounters, I rarely, if ever, met someone who didn't know about contraception or didn't know where to get it. But people often spoke about how their sexual lives were diminished in various ways by contraceptives, including by condoms. And so they would sometimes not use contraceptives at all or use them intermittently. So this is what got me interested in this topic. And then as I went into my higher education in behavioral science and public health and gender studies, really again was sort of missing the sexual component, but learning much more about, again, sort of contraception as a medical good and a public health good, as opposed to a sexual one. And so I've spent a good bit of my career trying to address what I call this pleasure deficit. So the gap between how people actually use contraceptives and the way we approach contraceptives from the science side. So what I want to do in my remaining time is talk a bit more about the pleasure deficit and why it matters. I want to talk about this concept of sexual acceptability that I hope I can convince all of you to integrate into your own research, even at just a conceptual level. And then I want to share 3 findings from our latest study. I want to thank those of you who have been in the same room with me where I've shared some of these ideas before. I appreciate the chance to say them again to you and say them for the first time to some of the rest of you. All right, so let's talk about the pleasure deficit. So this again is that gap between sexual contexts and treating contraception like a medical good. So let me show you some other examples of this pleasure deficit. So one is, like I've said, has to do with contraceptive research and development. So when we look back over decades of R&D, we see that few either currently FDA approved methods or in the pipeline methods have been extensively tested for their effects on sexuality, including things like orgasm, arousal. And this becomes more striking when we compare it to methods developed for male assigned bodies. We would, I think, all agree or just take for granted that a method in development for male bodies would be a non-starter if, for example, it prevented erectile functioning or prevented orgasm from occurring, right? We would attend to that and say it's a non-starter, but we don't do the same thing when it comes to methods by and large developed for female assigned bodies. We also see this in contraceptive marketing, both at a commercial level and at a public health social marketing level. And I always think it's fascinating that we use sex to sell just about everything in our culture, but not contraception, right? So I have documented over time that most ads for prescription contraceptives, at least in the United States, are very de-eroticized. I think some of you in your other country locations do this better than we do. But I always like to, as a contrast, right, put advertisements for erectile dysfunction drugs, which often show couples or more erotic or more sexual scenes. In contrast, I want to show you a few examples. Images from contraceptive advertisements tend to often show women by themselves or with friends, and they're rarely images or messages about sex. So this is a blurry ad from Seasonal, which is an extended release oral contraceptive. And here it says goodbye curse, goodbye Aunt Flo, goodbye monthly visit. and with this person standing alone in a field. So this notion of period control, right, being important and valuable, but very de-eroticized. I love these two images from Skyla, which is a leave-in gestural IUD in the United States, really capturing notions of sort of future orientation and how contraception allows you to meet your goals. I love this person catching a cello, coming down a slide, right? So not at all sexual images. Here's a Nexplanon ad with this sort of images of strength and independence. Here is another Nexplanon image, person in a yoga class. It's hard to imagine a person in a yoga class in an ad for erectile dysfunction drugs, right? So those are some examples from the commercial world, but we also see this in the public health campaign world. So very few campaigns promote contraceptives by touting their sexual enhancement properties, right? When in fact, contraceptives can enable more satisfying and pleasurable sex for many people. So that's another example of the pleasure deficit. I want to convince you that it isn't just interesting that this pleasure deficit exists, but it's consequential. And one consequence is that it perpetuates the notion that sex isn't important to women in the US, in other parts of the global North, and certainly in the global South. So I think this pleasure deficit tends to deny women of their sexual agency. I think it re-essentializes women as reproducers versus sexual agents in a way that we don't see a parallel with men. And one of my favorite illustrations of this is a comment from an NIH reviewer on one of my proposals who said, I'm just not convinced that sexuality matters to women. And it would be nearly impossible to imagine a reviewer making that comment if I had written the proposal about male contraception. Another consequence of the pleasure deficit is that it's bad for our science. It's a validity problem. So there's a gap between contraceptives users' realities and how we on the research side perceive those realities. And until we bridge that gap, we're going to have a consistent validity problem. We also, at a practice level, at a public health level, the pleasure deficit can prevent people from reaching their sexual health potential. And many of you are familiar with this beautiful definition of sexual health from the World Health Organization. And this definition says that sexual health is a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease. It requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences. And all of these underlying sections of this definition really lift up how we want to promote sexual well-being and flourishing, and not just the lack of sexual harm. I think we really, as researchers and practitioners, are all intellectually invested in promoting sexual health in this way. And so one of the ways we need to do that is to address the pleasure deficit and think about sexuality in our contraceptive research. So to address this gap, my colleagues and I have developed, with a lot of other research from amazing folks, of sexual acceptability. And let me explain a little bit about what this is. So we define sexual acceptability as how contraceptives affect sexual experiences and well-being, and how those effects in turn shape people's satisfaction with their method and how long they use it. And I think this is a pretty simple concept to get. Of course, it's very complex, and measuring it is very complex, and I'll be fully open about that. So my colleague Nicole Smith and I did a review where we reviewed as much empirical literature as we could find on this topic and tried to build up a conceptual model. And I'm going to flash up our conceptual paradigm here that's very busy, but what you can see is that there are many different factors here. There are individual level factors such as sexual functioning, pregnancy intentions, there are relationship factors, And then there are macro level factors. So we acknowledge that sexual acceptability is quite complex. We can't get it all in any one measure or study, but that shouldn't stop us from trying. In that review, we also found that most research on this topic focuses on physiologic domains. And these are things like lubrication, orgasm, libido, the physiology of sexual response. And these things are very important. But other key domains of sexual acceptability really matter. A few examples are sexual repercussions of side effects, such as changes in vaginal bleeding, psychological factors, such as disinhibition. And we've seen in a number of our qualitative and quantitative studies that feeling protected against pregnancy can really enhance people's sexual experiences if they really want to avoid pregnancy. Users' perceptions about their method's sexual effects. Do they think their method is having an impact? And this is the one, gang, that really ends up being important. So we'll come back to this. And relationship aspects, such as partner preferences, also matter. So in some of our current research, we've been trying to pick up some of these additional domains to address some of the gaps in the literature. We also are trying to address the fact that many of the existing studies have been cross-sectional. And without longitudinal studies, it's very difficult to see if sexual acceptability within, say, the first month of use will affect satisfaction and use over time. So we have tried to address some of those things with our latest study, and I want to share 3 very top level findings from that study. So I will highlight our aims, and I'm going to go deeper on 2 of them. So one of our aims is to assess sexual acceptability using multiple measures to try to get around some of those gaps among people starting one of 6 contraceptive methods, to determine the degree to which these measures, these sexual measures, are associated with continuation over time and satisfaction. And finally, and this is, I think, the most exciting piece of the work, is to develop an instrument that better measures contraceptive sexual acceptability, that in some ways takes the best of a variety of other things and puts them into something specific for contraceptive use and service delivery. My colleague, Dr. Jessica Sanders, is leading AIM 3 and has a manuscript she's finishing up to submit, which is exciting. So I'm going to focus today on these first 2 aims. The data from this come from the Her Salt Lake initiative, and my colleague, Dr. Dave Turok, is going to be talking about this initiative during his remarks. It is such an amazing initiative, and I've been so fortunate to get to work on it with Dave and his team. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about it here because it matters to the findings I'm going to present. So this is a clinic-based prospective longitudinal cohort study of people who come to one of 4 family planning clinics wanting a contraceptive method. They select whatever method they want to use, and they can switch or just continue their method for free at any time. They provide a lot of data at baseline, within the several times within the first 6 months, and then every 6 months for up to 3 years. Today, we'll really be focusing on the first 6 months, at least in my presentation. And it's just astonishing. Dave and his colleagues have been so successful in keeping folks engaged in this study over time and excited about the study over time. Our team is fantastic. We've got Dave here in the upper right, my colleague Jess Sanders, who really is a co-lead with me on this. We have 2 sociologists on the project, as well as a population health scientist. So in terms of the sample that I'm going to be sharing with y'all today, we had about 3,700 enrolled at baseline. This is a fairly young and diverse sample. 23 years is the median age. 43% were at or below the federal poverty line. About 1 in 3 identified as people of color. 87% identified as exclusively or mostly heterosexual. So we had some sexual diversity, although no gender diversity. And a variety of relationship types cohabiting, actively dating, single, and married. And today I'm going to focus on these 6 methods because 95% of the sample selected one of these methods at baseline. So you can see that levonorgestrel, IUDs were quite popular, as well as implants and pills, with fewer people selecting vaginal rings. I won't go through all of our measures, but I wanted to, I think, give you a snapshot of the richness of data that we were able to collect. So at baseline, we had a number of measures that became important control variables. In terms of repeated measures, we also had a variety of ones that we control for in our analyses here. The underlined measures here are 4 of the sexual acceptability measures that we used to see what emerged. And that second to last one, I'm really gonna talk about a lot, the perception of your method's impact on sexuality. These other underlined measures are important things that contraceptives affect in folks, right? Vaginal bleeding, physical and psychological side effects, as well as from overall health and well-being. So it was great that we were able to compare and contrast these sorts of experiences of methods with sexual experiences. So let me go back to this perception question for a moment. So this is the one that has ended up being just really important for us. So we just asked, hey, in the last month, would you say that your method has improved your sex life, had no effect on your sex life, or made your sex life worse? So I'll come back to this, but I wanted you to have the phrasing of the question there. So now I'm going to give these just very top level findings from 3 different papers that have come out of these data. So the first, let's just look at baseline for a minute. Forgetting about the longitudinal nature, let's just look at what do folks say when they come into a clinic and want to select a new method. So we asked, how important are each of the following characteristics to you in deciding which birth control method to use? We included things like efficacy, right? And the responses range from not at all important to extremely important. I'm going to show you a busy bar chart here, but I'm going to walk you through it. So these are people who said that various criteria were very important to them or extremely important to them. So what we see here are the various criteria, things like it's safe, it's effective. The total percents over here represent the percent of people who said that criterion was quite or extremely important to them. And then the different colors represent the methods that folks ended up selecting at that visit. So I'm going to highlight 2 things for you here. One is that while safety and efficacy clearly are quite important, they're closely followed by these 2 sexual related criteria. It doesn't interrupt sex and it doesn't affect libido. And in fact, those were about the same as saying it doesn't have side effects. So that's one thing I want you to take away from this. The second is that you see incredibly even method distribution within these criteria, meaning that 2 people with the exact same preferences could find their way into different methods for different reasons, right? So I think we need to remember in contraceptive users that a variety of methods might meet different people's preferences. So these findings came out in the journal Contraception last year, and I'll just summarize these top level findings. So we've concluded that in our study, many seekers of contraception ranked sexual related priorities highly alongside safety and efficacy, and that a range of methods may align with people's sexual priorities as well as their other priorities. So really emphasizing that no one method is perfect for everyone from a sexual perspective or otherwise. So that is study 1. Now I want to move into the longitudinal nature of the data. So what happens over time? And the first study we did here is what just happens to people's sexual measures over time by their method. And so what I'm going to do here is show you findings over time. So I'll walk you through this. So this is the female sexual function index. So here's the average score. This is a very widely used measure of sexual functioning. This is time, and the different colored lines represent different methods. And what you'll see here is that there's no change over time and that there's no significant difference between the method groups, right? So really, we're observing no changes in sexual functioning, which is certainly a lot better than seeing decreases in sexual functioning. We saw almost the exact same thing with this new scale of sexual satisfaction. So you see here the average scores by method over time, with not only stasis over time, but no significant difference by method. Where we see some interesting stuff emerge, though, is with this perception question. So remember, we asked, okay, in the last month, has your method affected your sex life? And if so, how? And so what we see here down on the bottom, these are folks who say their method made their sex life a lot worse in the first month, up to people who said their method improved their sex life a lot. The black bars represent the total. The other colored bars represent the different method groups. So what you'll see is that about half of people said that within the first month, their method improved their sex life. About 41% said there was no change, and about 17% said their method made their sex life worse in some way. So this is at 1 month. At 3 months, we see more regression to that neutral category. Still about 43% of people saying, hey, it improved my sex life a lot. And slightly over 10% saying it made my sex life a little worse. And by 6 months, again, about half of people in that neutral category, no effect, with fewer in those tails. But there are two things I'll draw your attention to here. One is that at any one time point, there are at least 3 times as many folks in that improvement category than in that detraction category, right? So we're essentially seeing much more presence of positive change due to method than negative change. And the other, I think, message here is that if a method changes one's sexual experiences, it's most likely to happen right away, right? In that first month of use. So these are basic descriptives from these data, but then we looked at a multivariate level in terms of what helps predict whether someone has a good sexual perception of their method. And what we found is that perceived sexual improvements were associated with decreased vaginal bleeding, which makes some sense, and that perceived sexual detractions were associated with more physical side effects, such as bloating, headaches, breast tenderness. Also makes sense. These findings appeared in the Journal of Sex Research earlier this year. And just to lift up the main takeaways from this paper, we found that while people may not experience changes in functioning or satisfaction, they do report both positive and negative sexual changes due to their method. And I would argue, as a behavioral scientist, that those perceptions matter a lot more than more quote unquote objective measures of sexual functioning. We also found that a substantial minority, and actually upwards of half of people, report contraceptive-related improvements to their sex lives, particularly when they have fewer side effects and decreased vaginal bleeding. So that is the second set of findings. And the final set of findings, also looking at longitudinal data, has to do with how does sexual acceptability in the first month of use predict use over time? And so our questions here were, can sexuality measures help predict whether people continue using their methods? And if so, how do these compare to other effects, vaginal bleeding, side effects, things that we often take into account a little more often? So I'm going to share with you the results here of a regression analysis. I'll say that the regression analysis controlled for a number of factors that we know influence contraceptive continuation. So things like age and relationship status, but also these sexual acceptability changes and some side effect changes. So you can see here, we have measured things like that perceived impact on sex life, changes in vaginal bleeding, sexual functioning, satisfaction, and then mood and physical side effects. These yellow circles represent odds ratios, with the whiskers representing these 95% confidence intervals. So we were surprised to see how few of these variables significantly predicted discontinuation. The one that really predicted it was this perceived impact on sex life. So compared to people who said their method improved their sex life a lot, people who said their sex life was worse due to their method had 3 times the odds of discontinuing by 6 months compared to those who said their sex lives got better. And for people who said it was a little worse, the odds were just under 2 of discontinuing. The only other significant variable here were people who reported less vaginal bleeding than before had reduced odds for discontinuation. So in general, people seem to like and appreciate decreased vaginal bleeding. These findings appeared this spring in JAMA Internal Medicine. And I'll give you just a sneak peek, or forgive me, let me summarize. So from that analysis, I think we're concluding that perceived sexual impacts of methods strongly predict whether people keep using them over time. And that the effect of this perceived impact in our analyses anyway, trumped the things that we paid more attention to in our contraceptive research and programming. So physical side effects, mood side effects, changes in vaginal bleeding. So those things are all important, but when we put sexual acceptability into the model, the sexuality factors may matter a lot more. Now, I want to just give you the sneak peek of a manuscript we have under review right now. In this analysis, we were examining contraceptive satisfaction as the outcome, not continuation. And satisfaction and continuation are closely related, but not 100%. So many people are using a method they actually don't want to be using, or they say that it's sort of the least bad alternative. So when we examined with the same variables, what helps predict contraceptive satisfaction, we found that sexual perception question mattered a lot. So people whose method made their sex life a lot better had nearly 8 times greater odds for contraceptive satisfaction than those who said their method made their sex life a lot worse. And to a lesser degree, we also saw the importance of bleeding decreases and physical side effects. So all of these things matter, but in terms of the largest driver of contraceptive satisfaction, we really found that sexual perception question to pop. So some closing thoughts, and I can't wait to hear some of your questions and reflections. I would love for all of us, even those who work in a lab with animal models, to assume that people who want to have sex but not get pregnant want methods that make their sex life better, or at least don't make their sex life worse, right? This makes intuitive sense. I know everyone understands it, but I think it's been missing from the science, including the basic science. I would love for contraceptive R&D to really attend to sexual acceptability for all types of bodies and identities. And by that, I mean, not just male assigned bodies, but female assigned bodies, bodies in Western contexts and in global South contexts, as well as people of different sexual identities and gender identities. I also would love to think about how we could promote the sex enhancing aspects of contraception, right? If contraception is good for your sex life, like, we should be promoting that more and encouraging folks to avail themselves, right, of this really valuable medical and sexual good. And I'd love to, in terms of a clinical and public health approach, really emphasize to clients and patients how you experience your method sexually really matters. So let's help you find a method that works for you sexually. And if it means we have to switch a couple times, let's do that. I'm grateful to the funders for this work and for you all. And I'll just end by saying, I really think we owe it to the people who ultimately our science is going to be serving to really try to attend to and promote their sexual well-being. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jenny. That was awesome. We have a few questions coming in the Q&A box, but please, everyone who's listening, start typing your questions. So the first one that came through early in your presentation, and you alluded to this later on, has to do with individuals who are not assigned male or female or don't embrace a specific male or female identity. Do you believe it's appropriate to discuss contraceptive medicine exclusively about women? If no, do you have a suggestion on how we can broaden the horizon to include the LGBTQ community? Can you expand a little bit more on that idea?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. Thank you. I think it's absolutely essential to think about and attend to the variety of people who use contraception, not all of whom identify as women. At times, I use the term women when I talk about this work because I think we need to talk about women as a political category, right? And not just a type of body. And because unfortunately, so much of the literature we have doesn't distinguish, right, by cis versus transgender folks. So I'm often limited in that way, but I really appreciate the ways in which we need to examine the sexual experiences and other experiences of contraception among gender diverse folks and not just cisgender women. And if you have other thoughts or comments on that, I'm delighted to see them in the chat. Or I'm sorry, not the chat, because I think the chat is not open, but in the question and answer, if you have further questions or further recommendations on that.
Yeah, if we could get any follow-up on that topic, that would be very interesting. The next question is, what is the major innovative finding of this work? And does the fact that women want methods that are easier to use and not interfere with their lives a novel finding? Or, more specifically, if you could drill down about what is truly new about your research and how does this inform contraception research and development?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I mean, I clearly have failed you if I haven't made that clear in my comments so far, but I'll underscore that. I think what's innovative about this work is that in decades of research on the behavioral science of contraception, right? How people orient toward their contraceptive method, whether they like it, whether they use it, almost all of that research has failed to attend to or measure sexuality. And ours not only measures sexuality, but it does it in a variety of ways, as opposed to just physiologically. And it does it longitudinally with a large population. So I think for me to be able to, with this sample size, show that, that these sexual measures, or at least the sexual perception measure, really does drive contraceptive and contraceptive satisfaction and continuation, to me, that's novel, but mostly it's just really important and valuable. This question about how does this inform contraception R&D is an excellent one, and of course why you all are here. And I'm not a bench scientist, and so would never want to say like, well, this is how you should do it in your work, right? Because I wouldn't want you to tell me how to do behavioral science. But I do think that I would love for you all to, even as you're going into your research questions or going into your aims, think about the ultimate user, like at the end of this, who is the user and what do they want? And I think you all know this intuitively, but people want to be able to enjoy their sex lives while having protection against pregnancy. And even just keeping that person in mind, I think is a really useful start. And especially folks who are further down the pipeline of research and development, so particularly when they're starting to test these methods in people, that in any pivotal trial, for example, you're asking patients or you're asking participants about their sexual experiences with the method. And you're asking them what appeals to them or not sexually about the method. Those would be other, I think, really basic things that one could incorporate. And Jeff, if you have, again, sort of follow-up questions or thoughts, I'm very excited to read them.
And I think Daryl is asking the same question that I'm thinking about is, as someone who is, sort of a basic scientist looking at contraceptive targets, what are sort of the features of contraceptives that contraceptive users might want to see developed in the future?
Yeah, it's so fabulous to see you all thinking about this. And one of the things that has struck me again and again with our analyses of these data is that a variety of attributes meet a variety of people's needs, right? So it would be far too simplistic to say, well, this is a feature that people want or that all the people want. And I think my colleagues, Jess Sanders and Dave Turok, would have more to say on this from some of the qualitative data from participants in their study. But we do certainly see a lot of folks saying that they want non-hormonal methods that aren't as intense as, say, the copper IUD, or don't have some of the bleeding side effects of the copper IUD, or are user dependent, right? So more used for the sexual moment as opposed to used all the time. So I do think that increased number of non-hormonal methods are really important. I don't want to extrapolate too much more on that question, given that my research is really about what are contraceptive users in this study saying about the methods that exist. And many of them are quite frankly saying when people get to select the method they want and then switch, the satisfaction rates in these data are high. People can really like their method as long as they're, again, sort of able to find one that meets their needs and are able to switch easily. So I'm not saying we don't need new targets and new methods to have a deep toolbox, but that also, if part of the puzzle here is that we need healthcare systems to be able to allow people to switch without causing too much cost to themselves or their insurers.
Okay, and I just want to mention to everyone in attendance, please ask your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. All right, next question. Amelia says that was a wonderful presentation. For those of us working to develop new methods for men and women, how and when during the lengthy development process should we be incorporating evaluation of sexual impact, and what measures should we use?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think I alluded to this a little bit in my response to Jeff's question, that at a minimum, I would hope that when you get to the human stage of R&D and are actually getting information from people who are using a new method and trying it out, that at that point, for sure, you would include at least that, very least, that question of, are you perceiving that your method is having a sexual impact? And my colleague Jessica Sanders is developing this really exciting measure of contraceptive sexual acceptability that integrates a variety of domains that we're hoping to have ready really soon. And so that would be the measure that we would love to see validated and used more in these studies as well. So thanks for your question.
All right. Lynetta asks, how much might decreases in bleeding associated with greater satisfaction be contributing to users saying that their method made their sex life a lot better by less interruption by regular or irregular bleeding?
Yeah, you're right on. And we do find a strong overlap, right, between these two things. And so when we were examining what experiences of methods most predicted people saying their method made their sex life a lot better, reduced vaginal bleeding was a big part of that, right? So we did see that. And in a pilot study of about 200 IUD and implant users, we also saw strong associations between decreased bleeding and use over time. So they are very strongly related, but not entirely related. And so there are other elements, I think, captured in that, did this method make your sex life a lot better, such as items we weren't necessarily able to capture: psychological disinhibition, partner thinking it's working for them as well, and just your overall sense of like how you feel in your sexual body when you use it. So bleeding is a big part of it, but not the only part.
All right, and we have a question from Brian who says, such a great talk. Did you happen to find any significant differences in sexual satisfaction or dissatisfaction by method in either the long or the short term? Were differences tied more to symptoms related to the method, for example, headache, bleeding, and bloating?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brian, and it's both. So all of our models controlled for method type, right? Because we know there are going to be differences there. I will say overall, I was much more struck by similarities across methods than differences, right? And so one of the things I really don't want to come out of this study is this sense of, oh, the leave-in-a-gestural IUD is really good for your sex life, so you should use that, right? Because different people are relating to their methods in different ways. IUDs and implants, IUDs in particular, tended to have pretty good sexual reports. But I think that it's these symptoms you get to in your question here. It's really the experiences of physical side effects, the experiences of vaginal bleeding that tend to be the bigger drivers of sexual experience rather than the method itself. One exception to that, copper IUD users, interesting group of people in this study, in general reported much more bleeding with their method, but still reported really good sexual outcomes. So there's something about that group of people who might be able to tolerate increased bleeding quite well in exchange for other perceived benefits, such as lack of hormones. So, so they're an interesting exception to this. I hope that answered your question, Brian.
All right, and we have one final question. In your long-term 3-year longitudinal studies, is it your plan to examine the sexuality consequences of your patients that switch methods during the course of study?
Yeah, hold on, let me think about this for a moment. Yeah, no, thank you for that. I essentially, because a number of these clients switch methods because they can and it's readily available to them, in many ways, resetting a method gives you a chance to sort of remeasure these sexual acceptability measures and the other measures. So we haven't done that a ton yet. We've been trying to sort of hold steady a baseline group of people and to see what happens over time. But it will be interesting to compare, say, a user who has bad sexual outcomes with one method, switches, changes to another, do our sexual outcomes improve? And certainly we would hope so. So it's a great idea for future analyses.
Okay, I want to catch this one last quick question. Did your research subjects include anyone in the sub-Saharan area where use of contraceptives may not be religiously or socially accepted?
Thank you for the question. This study was entirely made up of people from the United States, and in particular in the state of Utah and in the county of Salt Lake City. And your question really elevates the fact that promoting contraceptives as a sexual good is hard enough in a setting where contraceptive use is seen as acceptable, in places in which contraceptives are seen as less acceptable, or where women's sexuality may be particularly taboo. This is really tricky. But I would hasten us to not perpetuate the notion that sexuality doesn't matter in other contexts, including the ones you allude to here. But thank you for that.
All right, thank you so much, Jenny. That was a wonderful presentation. And we will be moving on to our next presentation, which will be by Dr. David Turok from the University of Utah and the Planned Parenthood Association of Utah. Dr. Turok is a physician researcher who completed residencies in family medicine and OBGYN and is now the chief of family planning division at the University of Utah and also the director of surgical services at Planned Parenthood in Utah. He and the Utah Family Planning Research Team investigates ways to support people getting the contraceptive method they want on the day they present for care, including projects that have provided over 20,000 people with no-cost contraceptive care. He's also contributed significantly to a growing body of literature assessing IUDs for quick start use and as emergency contraception. The title of Dr. Turok's presentation today is Utah Contraception as You Want It.
Thank you very much, Diane. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all. And as a clinical researcher who's not really neither a basic scientist nor a behavioral researcher, I feel very comfortable being in the company of those people because they are my collaborators. So I feel very well situated. We have had 3 of the hottest weeks since I have been living in Utah. And I thought this picture of a cooler day and a cooler environment was a good place to start. As a not young OBGYN, I've been present many thousands of times when people have trusted me to care for them at critical moments in their contraceptive journeys and pregnancies. And I have seen, heard, and felt their exhaustion, elation, pain, grief, and plain relief. And from these experiences, I have learned to trust women, trust people. And if you're a person in Utah with limited financial means, it has always been harder than it needs to be to access your human right to obtain the contraceptive method you want. And after years of living in this world, I joined forces with a bunch of colleagues who committed to right this wrong. And I remember the very first time I talked to the staff at the Salt Lake City Planned Parenthood Clinic about the first study we were going to do. And I told them, we're going to do this so our patients have more choices and fewer barriers, and they can get the care that they want. And someday people will say, hey, we want to do it like they're doing it in Utah and mean it in a good way. And that is exactly why it's so exciting to speak to you now about some progress we've made. So like a lot of you, our team at the University of Utah has a role in bringing new contraceptive methods to the marketplace. And we participate heavily in contraceptive clinical trials and testing. We also do a lot of research trying to break down contraceptive access barriers. And the overarching goal of what I'm going to talk about today is moving toward a place where any person gets the method that they want on the day that they want it. And inherent in this is acknowledging decisions about reversible contraceptive methods, that they are not a lifetime commitment. And if the method that you get today doesn't work for you, then come on back and we'll help you get what you want. That is the method and the message at our clinics now. So our work stems from the perspective that all people deserve equitable access to all contraceptive methods at all times in all communities. So let's take a closer look at what that means in practice. I'm going to talk about 3 different projects. And the first is a county-wide contraceptive initiative that Jenny spoke about as the source of data for a bunch of her work, the Her Salt Lake Contraceptive Initiative. And then I'll talk about how that led to a statewide initiative called Family Planning Elevated. And then finally, I'll just very briefly talk about some work we're doing to build the evidence so that, people can get any method of contraception that they want, including IUDs started as a quick start method. These are my disclosures. Reproductive justice is, amazingly, we've gotten this far into Ford talks about contraception and not talked about this. And hopefully this is a concept that's familiar to people. But I just want to frame some of my comments through the lens of reproductive justice. It's a beautiful human rights approach that always enriches any conversation about sex and reproduction. and grounds the discussion in justice. RJ, as it's frequently called, is founded on the basic idea that all people have the right to have a child, not have a child, and parent their children in safe and healthy environments, and have sex with whom they like, how they choose. And many images can represent RJ. I particularly like this picture of a young Loretta Ross and her groundbreaking synthesis on the subject as a nod to the insightful, justice-minded women of color who created the movement and have so much to teach us about every aspect of this work. And it's beautiful to consider that a human rights focus can become the default of all the work that we do. It's been around for decades now and is a great antidote to the ridiculous pro-choice, pro-life divide that's destroyed civil discourse in our country. We must acknowledge that anything that involves people controlling fertility can also be used to oppress marginalized people and to further political and social agendas like paternalism, white supremacy, and eugenics. And it can thankfully be used to create opportunities for heterosexually involved people who don't desire pregnancy. And as Jenny had told you, I'm going to talk about the Her Salt Lake Contraceptive Initiative and Family Planning Elevated. And Her started out as basically an effort to get people highly effective, reversible contraceptive methods in Salt Lake County, because that's the thing that had the greatest barrier to access, because they're the most costly. And it focused on IUDs and implants. And it quickly grew to an embracement of all contraceptive methods, so that to embrace all of her contraceptive methods. And that's a nod not just to women who chose this, but people who identified and needed female-oriented methods at any point. So that emphatic support was a transition, and one that people I cared for and colleagues really helped explain and bring me along. And I would say the biggest difference in clinical care through research that we've done and influence of others has really been the difference in centering these highly effective methods 10 years ago, and now seeing my job in every interaction with people I speak to as my job is to inform them about all of their options and make sure if they can get whatever they want on the day they're there, and if they don't like that, to be able to come back and get a new method at any time. So this countywide contraceptive initiative, Her Salt Lake, we partnered with our local Planned Parenthood affiliate, Planned Parenthood Association of Utah, simply because they provide the best care to people with the greatest need in our community at the lowest cost. And in March 2016, anyone coming to one of the 4 health centers in Salt Lake County could walk out with any method of contraception they wanted without cost, and people could return as many times as they wanted to change their method over the next 3 years. We served 7,402 people with no cost care, almost twice what we expected when we were planning the initiative. And over 4,400 of them enrolled in a 3-year prospective study that's enabled us to use data for a bunch of different assessment and outcomes, including the work that Jenny spoke about earlier. And they've provided us with 3 years of follow-up data. And we've looked at not just health outcomes, but educational opportunities, sexual acceptability, and financial outcomes, and pregnancy outcomes. So this is just one of the outcomes that we've looked at. This is over time looking at changes in contraceptive uptake when people enrolled in the study. And this aqua line at the top represents people who left the clinic with pills, patches, and ring. And this red vertical line is the switch to no-cost care. And you can see a steep drop at that time when we switched to no-cost care and provided clinics with more clinicians to place, to provide care and place IUDs and implants on any day when people presented, as well as stocking all methods, especially IUDs and implants in clinic, so that clinics did not run out of methods. And you can see at that transition to no-cost care and those other changes at the vertical red line, there's a drop in people who are receiving pill patches, rings, and injectable contraception. While at the same time, there's an increase, and that's noted by this purplish line as it ascends. And these obviously come closer, so that in the beginning, about 1 in 5 people were receiving an IUD or an implant, and at the end, about 1 in 3. These data really demonstrate clearly that when we remove barriers, people, and were able to choose more freely, there was a switch in the contraceptive method mix. And that, no surprise to me as somebody who'd been having conversations with people for many years, that people weren't getting what they wanted initially. And the Salt Lake Contraceptive Initiative provided us with some key takeaways. The results from the study demonstrated there was real demand to expand services, and the data were used to support a family planning Medicaid waiver, legislation sponsored by Republican House Representative Ray Ward, and the bill passed with veto-proof majorities in both houses in both Utah houses. And now more than ever, rational, dedicated public servants like Ray Ward are a too rare and highly cherished commodity. We also learned that the importance of building relationships with elected officials and coalitions and advocacy groups. And Salt Lake also created the platform to expand services statewide. And that is where Family Planning Elevated comes in, our second initiative. Utah did a very late and feeble ACA Medicaid expansion up to 100% of the federal poverty level and placed additional restrictions. And this is still being wrangled through our government. And Family Planning Elevated applies what we learned at the Planned Parenthood clinics in Salt Lake to community clinics across the state. Family Planning Elevated addresses 3 Ps. We meet patients where they are across Utah, wherever they come for primary care, not just at Planned Parenthood clinics. And we're covering contraceptive services up to 250% of the federal poverty level, including undocumented immigrants who have never been covered by Medicaid in our state. And second, FPE trains health center providers and staff so that they can offer the full range of contraceptive methods. And FPE assists policymakers in passing evidence-based legislation. The project thus far has provided care to over 20,000 people, no cost care. And if we add that to the over 7,000 served during Salt Lake, we're approaching 30,000 people who've received no cost care in the state, a significant advance. We continue to assess the social, medical, and financial impacts of this work. This slide shows our Salt Lake collaborators and sponsors. And both these programs, Salt Lake and FPE, are unique among contraceptive access projects. There's a bunch of these going on in different states throughout the US. We've used our bold optimism to gather a broad base of support. We have support from community members, pharmaceutical companies, local and national foundations, the NIH, and the Society of Family Planning for Salt Lake. And we focused on a broad interpretation of the outcomes, looking at social, educational, economic outcomes, not just the medical ones. And we've always had a specific policy target, Medicaid expansion, which continues to be a significant challenge. But we know that just our support is not, cannot be ongoing forever, and that we have to have a real backer that has the long-term interest in this forever and the resources to support it. And we definitely have that as a society. These are the sponsors and collaborators for Family Planning Elevated, some similar and some different. And then finally, I just wanted to mention some work that we're doing in a recent publication on the levonorgestrel IUD for emergency contraception.
David, in the interest of time, it is time to wrap it up. Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, this study just showed that the LNG IUD is effective for emergency contraception, and there was one pregnancy among 317 people who got this. And this is just another clinical chance for us to improve care, and it's been the basis of change at Planned Parenthood Federation of America for over 600 clinics that are now doing this kind of care and providing IUDs to anyone at any time when they have a negative pregnancy test. So thank you very much for your interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your talk. In the interest of time, we are going to be moving forward. So anyone with questions, please reach out to David directly. Our final presenter today is Pawat Patarawat. I apologize for whatever I did to your name, sir. From Rutgers University. And the title of this presentation is The Development of a Tiered High Throughput Compound Testing and Ovulation Screening for the Ovulation-Based Non-Hormonal Contraceptive Discovery.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duffy. You are fine with my last name. Yeah, and also good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about how we, Today I'm going to talk about how we use our tiered high throughput ovulation screening pipeline for non-hormonal contraceptive discovery. So why do we need non-hormonal contraceptive? The hormonal contraceptive that are in the market now have many side effects, such as cancer, stroke, obesity, and depression. That's the reason why they are not desirable for women all around the world. So it is urgent to develop cheaper and safer non-hormonal contraceptives. However, the current non-mammalian model is hard to translate to clinical trial, and the current mammalian model are low throughput. Because of that, we are developing the high throughput compound testing and ovulation screening pipeline using in vitro mouse follicle culture model. Sorry, I have some issue. So in our lab, we established a 3D encapsulated in vitro follicle growth, or EIVFG method, to culture mouse follicles. So we collect immature mouse follicle and culture them to the pre-ovulatory stage to reach the maturation. The mature follicle can undergo ovulation process, including the follicle ruptures, COC expansion, oocyte maturation, and luteinization after stimulated by the HCG. We also use single follicle RNA sequencing technique to demonstrate that our model preserves the molecular signature of the ovulation. So our lab member Jiang will talk more about how our model preserves the molecular signature on August 4th. So I will not go deeper into this topic. Today I will focus on how we use this EIVFG model for our tiered screening pipeline. By using the EIVFG model, we established a tiered high throughput screening pipeline for non-hormonal contraceptive. And because we use this pipeline for screening more than 10,000 compounds, we also developed a vitrification method to establish a high content follicle bank. In this way, we can have many follicles stored and sort them out whenever we want. My lab member, Ying Jung, will talk more about this in his poster presentation. So for our tier screening, we separate this process into 3 tiers. As tier 1, we will use single high dose screening. And if the compound could inhibit the follicle rupture, we will perform progesterone ELISA to evaluate the luteinization and hormone secretion. And if this compound pass tier 1, we will use dose response exposure and make the progesterone measurement to confirm the ovulation inhibition effect. And for tier 3, we will identify the mechanism of the compound by using single follicle sequencing or real-time PCR to identify the molecular target pathway. And then we will validate in vivo ovulation by using mouse superovulation model. The compound that passed 3 tiers will be considered as a high contraceptive promise. But if they fail, they're gonna be considered as a low contraceptive promise. On next slide, I will show you the screening result of 12 compounds as an example for our tier screening pipeline. So here we use a 12 caliber compound, which has been tested with the Drosophila model by Dr. Jen Jun Sun group to establish a standard operation procedure for our screening pipeline. So we found that the compound number 3, 6, 8, 10, 11, and 12 inhibits the in vitro ovulation. So we then proceed to perform ELISA to check on the progesterone secretion. So our progesterone ELISA results show that the compound number 3, 6, and 8 significantly decreased progesterone level. So we cannot use this compound further. However, the compound number 10, 11, 12 did not affect the ability of the follicle to produce progesterone. That means these compounds are good candidates for non-hormonal contraceptive. So we further use this 3 compound for tier 2 screening. So the compound number 11 is chlorpromazine or CPZ, which is a dopamine receptor antagonist. For this compound, we collaborate with Dr. Sun group, and we demonstrate that it can also inhibit follicle rupture in both in vivo and in vitro mouse model by using our screening pipeline. So this data was published in PNAS already, so I won't talk about it today because of the time restriction. Today, I will use compound number 12, which is a proprotein convertase inhibitor or PCI as an example on how we perform tier screening. The proprotein convertase or PCs were found to be essential for activating other proteins that involved in many biological processes. So next step is to perform the dose response experiment in tier 2 of the screening. Our tier 2 results show that the PC at 1 or 10 micromolar can inhibit ovulation, and it did not disrupt the hormone secretion. This result confirm that the PC inhibit ovulation in a dose response manner. So we could use this drug to test the tier 3 screening. In our tier 3, we use the real-time PCR to investigate the expression of the PC genes during ovulation. It has been already demonstrated that the PCSK3 of urine can be induced by SCG, but our real-time PCR data show that PCSK5A and PCSK6 were also significantly upregulated during the in vitro ovulation process. And we confirm this result by using the in situ RNA hybridization. So interestingly, the PC were found to activate many proteolysis enzymes, including matrix metalloprotease, which have been shown to facilitate the follicle rupture during the ovulation. So next step, we will focus on the effect of PCI on MMP. So we hypothesize that the LS surge can increase the PC, and PC would further activate MMP, which play an important role in the extracellular matrix remodeling to facilitate the ovulation. So we investigate the MMP activity by using the in situ seismography method. And our results show that the MMP activity are increased after SCG treatment, and we have found that the MMP activity are higher in control group than the PCI treated group. This indicates that the PCI could inhibit MMP during ovulation. However, this PCI is a pan-PC inhibitor, not a specific one. So we will use the siRNA or CRISPR to determine which one of them are truly important. So based on these results, here are our take-home message. So our GL screening is a powerful model for non-hormonal contraceptive screening, and PC can activate MMP during ovulation. And the next step, we will use this pipeline to screen the Reframe library for non-hormonal contraceptive discovery. And last but not least, I would like to thank my PI, Dr. Chiao, and our lab member at Rutgers University. I also would like to thank our collaborators and NIH and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for funding our research. And thank you so much. And I'll happily taking any questions.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. We do have a question. The first one, does PCI inhibit the zone of pellucidar formation since the completion of ZP extracellular matrix formations dependent on furin activity?
That's a good question. That's a good information. Actually, we don't have this data when we should check that in the future.
Do you have any idea of the mechanism of action of this compound?
The mechanism of the PC inhibitor?
Yeah.
So you mean for the ovulation?
Right.
So we think it's so it might affect the extracellular matrix remodeling by so this PC, it will I mean, sorry, I was a little bit nervous. So normally PC, the MMP is one of the substrate of the PCs. So we think that the PC could, if we inhibit the PC, then it inhibit the activation of MMP. So MMP cannot remodel the extracellular matrix of the follicles, and then it couldn't inhibit the follicle rupture process, which is very important for the ovulation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I see that we're running out of time for today's presentation, so I think that'll be our last question. Thanks so much for that really interesting presentation.
Thank you.
And that will conclude the presentations for this symposium. On behalf of the organizing committee and SSR, I'd like to extend a very sincere thank you to each of our speakers for sharing their work with us today. I'd also like to recognize the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of this symposium. And thanks to each and every one of you who attended and for your contributions to contraception and contraceptive research. When you exit this webinar, there will be a brief survey. Please provide feedback on your experience. Completing the survey will allow us to serve the SSR members and our attendees better in the future. So this concludes the first of the 3 sessions of this year's Contraceptive Symposium. Please remember that there are 2 more sessions, Wednesday, July 28th and Wednesday, August 4th, and they will have the same start time as today's event. Also, the SSR business meeting will be held on Thursday, August 5th, beginning again at the same time. The business meeting will use the same Zoom link that you used to attend this symposium. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you all next week.